Today, we are diving into the fascinating world of vampires, Gothic literature, and their imprints in European intellectual history with our guest, Dr. Matthew Gibson. He is an associate professor of English literature at the University of Macau and is widely recognized as a leading scholar on Bram Stoker. He influentially argues in his book Dracula and the Eastern Question that classic vampire texts like Stoker's Dracula and Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla should be read in the context of late Victorian politics, especially the Eastern Question, a term referring to the political and diplomatic issues surrounding the Ottoman Empire. More widely, his scholarship spans across topics such as W.B. Yeats, modernism, European Gothic and fantastic literature, Bulgarian book history, and literary theory. Most recently, he has published a fascinating novel, Mr. Stoker and the Vampires of the Lyceum. If you are interested to know what kinds of souls or medical conditions vampires were supposed to have in the 19th century, and why so many vampire hunters come from Germany or Sweden or Switzerland, such as Van Helsing, this episode is for you. So, without further ado, let's go to Dr. Gibson.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gibson, for joining us today for discussing your amazing scholarship on vampires and your recent fictional forays. So we'll come into all of that. But before that, I'm just curious about, why you decided to work on the vampire. That's my first question.
There are various answers to this. One of them is actually more to do with a life situation. I moved in 1997 to work at the American University in Bulgaria, which is set in a small town in the southwest of that country. And whilst I was there, I was teaching Victorian literature, and I was teaching, in particular, Dracula. And one of the things that happened at the same time was that Elizabeth Miller articles about Dracula, and there was one article which showed that most of the topography which Stoker had actually taken from reading E.C. Johnson's travelogue on the track of the Crescent was in actual fact incorrect, that they put Varna as being in Romania, and a lot of the topography is wrong. And so my students all pointed this out to me. So I got interested from that point of view. So I started reading more and discovering that Bram Stoker had actually been very interested in East European politics. And that was what led me to see the vampire, which is obviously a Gothic trope, a Gothic figure, and something that is obviously based on a superstition dating from the 1730s. If this was something that in reality was actually being represented in Gothic texts of terror, texts that combine the supernatural with the realistic, but also could be seen as a subliminal way of talking about politics and attitudes at the time. And the crucial thing was when you looked at it in terms of what was being written in the newspapers, what the alliances between different countries were, it gave me a very, very different understanding to the one that was being presented through the very totalizing and hegemonic understanding of Orientalism presented in his book by Edward Said. And so I wrote a book that didn't challenge everything in Orientalism. There are some elements where you see that argument about seeing the East as inferior and infantile and feminine, etc. Sometimes that is true, but it isn't always true. It's in a lot of cases the opposite to that is true, and that was something that was a view of mine that was augmented by the work, brilliant book, by the way, which I recommend everyone reads, Imagining the Balkans by Maria Todorova, published in 1997, which shows that the Said version of looking at the Near East is in actual fact not quite correct. That liberals tended to have a very negative attitude of the Ottoman Empire, and conservatives and aristocrats had a very positive one, okay, which is also to do with a kind of Islamophilia that was prevalent amongst aristocrats in Britain in the 19th century.
Yeah, thanks for that, for weaving your own initial impetuses of working on the vampire with the state of scholarship on vampirism in this period. And that reminds me also of how, of course, the question of Orient gets complicated when we move out of the Middle East, in which Said's work is mainly posited. So We have works like Thomas Troutman's work on India, where there is this
Yeah,
huge phase of Indomania, which is then, followed by sort of Indophobia much later. So the question of the
yeah,
Orient is also a lot complicated in South Asia. But I would like you to elaborate a little bit on how your focus on the Turkish question, as you mentioned it in your book, complicate the idea of the Orient. So all of that are drawing attention to different components of the East, if I'm
yeah,
understanding it rightly. So how
yeah.
how does the focus on Turkey and Ottoman Empire complicate the understanding of the Orient?
Well, there are two major ways. First of all, the point that I was making before, that if you say what Maria Todorova does is she says that there are two different discourses in relation to the Ottoman Empire, and the what we know is really from the 1870s onwards was often characterized as including areas that we now understand very much as being part of Europe. The area at the time didn't actually quite exist exactly as a country in the same way it did after 1913 and the Second Balkan War, because a lot of Macedonia was still under Turkish rule. But it complicates it if we look at this, because there's European Turkey land, then there's Asia Minor, then there's of course Saudi Arabia, what became Saudi Arabia, all of which at different times were under Ottoman rule. And the important fact that there were very, very different understandings of its moral nature from British and French aristocrats writing at that time. One is the reason that as countries like Britain ceded more and more to the common, to democracy, as the House of Lords became less important than the House of Commons. So also there were those that looked at Turkish rule and saw it as having this much more feudal and, in their view, much more morally correct rule. They feared democracy, they feared the bourgeoisie, and they feared the common man. And they saw Turkish rule, Turkish pashas, Turkish ayans as having pretty much complete power in the area that they were in. And so they admired this. And they're constantly talking about the nobility of the Turks. But the other reason is actually purely economic. And this does actually relate to India. And the belief that the great game, the constant fight with Russia. Russia always saw, it almost invaded Constantinople in 1812. It always saw India and the Bosphorus as its own area, an area that it should control. And if we're talking about the Bosphorus, let's just say plus ça change, because that's pretty much how the president of Russia sees things now. And this, for Britain and also for France, was a huge problem because they didn't want to get rid of those trade routes. And crucially, they didn't want India and the power over India to be compromised at that time in terms of trade routes. So the Turks this is one of the major reasons for the Crimean War. The Turks were a falling empire, unable to control its burgeoning Christian populations, who are often richer than their Muslim populations. And Britain and France wanted to do everything they could to maintain it. But that doesn't mean to say that Turkey wasn't an independent arbiter in itself, or that the Ottomans weren't. And that brings us to the other problem that I found with Said, was that he talks about how first of all, he brings this idea of a hegemonic discourse in which the West is male, the East is female, the West is adult, the East is infantile, and one is rational and the other is irrational. And this is hegemonic. And he goes right back to the Persian Wars to try and see this seamlessly working through. But in actual fact, ignores the fact that when he does that, he then talks about how, going back to what he says, that this Orientalism, as he sees it, as a hegemonic discourse, was an idea that created the idea of control. Control was not really control, it was often accommodation. Linda Colley talks about this, how fearsome the Turks appeared to 18th century British merchants, and how much power they actually had, and how much power they actually maintained right up until 1924. And to a great extent, what you see in Orientalism is a lack of recognition of the Turks as an actual power. It's as though right from the times of Napoleon onwards, from the end of the Napoleonic Wars, you just have this situation of British and French domination and control over areas that were actually dominated by an Islamic power. And this is almost erased from Said's understanding, as though the actual discourse leads towards a reappropriation and modification of the concrete political realities. Okay. But of course, one must always remember that this love of the Turks, whilst there was a genuine feeling amongst aristocrats of admiring the nobility and the lack of complication, emotional complication that the Turks supposedly had compared to the Westerners at the time, it was also for many people simply to do with self-interest, because Russia was the great threatening power. And as I said, it's amazing when we look at the world today to see how that 19th century world seems to have, with some degrees of difference, obviously I'm talking from China now, how it seems to have just suddenly sprung up and reasserted itself with all those same fault lines. It's very bizarre.
Yeah, thanks for tying that in nicely with the current geopolitical scenario. So to go back to the vampire, you already shared some fascinating details about the British context of this interest in the vampires, especially with Bram Stoker. But I'm curious to know how is the French context of vampirism, and
Yeah.
why is there this interest?
Okay. I mean, I haven't really spoken about the difference between the vampire as a craze in the 18th century and then the literary vampire from Polidori onwards. These are two different things. Vampire as an idea exists long before that. It exists really from the huge hubbub created over the events at Kiselova and Medvedia, the two places where within the Austro-Hungarian Empire where Serbian peasants reported cases of vampirism. And this was inspected initially by a man in Kiselova, but then later by two doctors who gave reports who controversially asserted that the bodies that they were exhuming, which had apparently all been infected by this vampire Arnold Paule, in actual fact could genuinely be vampires. And then of course this massive debate erupts all over Europe. How the hell can you believe this? This is superstition. No. Vampires could actually be true, particularly if we're talking about the vampire being an astral body. All sorts of critics are talking about this at the time. All sorts of doctors are. And this then gets repeated in the press in the 1700s. Now, okay, so the work of Charles Foreman in his book published in 1741, all about the 1688 revolution. He talks about blood-sucking vampires, leeches. And this is what he means is people who are just taking money for nothing out of the exchequer or the estate. And this becomes a dead metaphor right the way up until the French Revolution. People talk about capitalists, vampires, etc. Until much later in the 19th century, this metaphor, this economic metaphor, gets taken up by Engels and Marx. Marx in particular, he talks about how the capitalist is like a vampire who sucks dead labor. That's the interesting point. He doesn't talk about money. He talks about labor, the idea that excess value on capital is created through the exploitation of labor, etc., which is not how the original people who used that financial metaphor used it. But in 1816, after Byron has written his text, the Giaour, which mentions the vampire, again, as a very political reaction to the Ottoman situation, you have Polidori writing the short story, which is originally really a kind of satire on Byron himself. It's about the nasty, arrogant aristocrat who goes around Greece and Italy rampaging and killing women for his own desire, and who then gets his Aubrey, his associate, to swear that he won't tell what he saw, i.e. his death, for a year and a day. And having made him swear, he then goes back and courts Aubrey's sister, with Aubrey not being able to do anything about it. This was obviously originally written by Polidori, but everyone thought it was written by Byron. And the crucial point about this story is obviously it obviously has certain political ideas in that which have been interpreted by various scholars in different ways. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the crucial thing is that it becomes a mania. And it becomes a mania mainly to begin with in France. Charles Nodier, along with Pierre Carmouche and Achille Geoffroy, turned this into a stage play in 1820, which is phenomenally successful. It has loads and loads of imitators. And they transport the story into Scotland. It's then translated and massively adapted by J. Robinson Blanchet in 1821 in Drury Lane, and becomes the play that he calls The Bride of the Isles. It's hugely popular. And so the whole mania for the vampire takes off in France as well, largely thanks to Charles Nodier, who wrote works like Smara, which has a sort of vampire figure in it. And then this goes on further. We have a work like La Dame Pâle by Dumas, which is, again, a story all about two brothers who fight over a woman, and they both become vampires as a result of this. And the woman, when she sees the vampire, has a pale face, which she never gets rid of. And it was basically partly fueled by the mania with Byron's, what people thought was Byron's story. It was actually Polidori's, and the aristocratic vampire, and partly by the growing interest in folk tradition and folklore. And this is something that you find in the work of Mérimée. He writes lots of folk tales or folk poems, which he then published, pretending that they were by a Guzla player in Dalmatia. They were actually written by himself. And again, it's about partly a reaction to Eastern Europe. It partly deals with political events. Nearly all of these stories have relations either with French political stories or French political history, or with Near Eastern political history. There's always a commentary in some way or other, regardless of the terror and horror that the vampire might actually cause as well, which of course is one of the major reasons for reading the text. So both France and Britain have a rich vein of vampire literature in this period.
Yeah, I love the different domains that you mentioned, the economic, medical, folkloristic, and interesting in how all of those come together. And it kind of reminds me, curiously, the economic dimension. There are actually Bengali ghost stories with blood-sucking witches, which have iconography similar to mosquitoes, who are apparently transporting blood to Britain. And with this question of resources being drawn, etc., empire. And there is also this non-fictional text. It's in English. It's called Poverty and the Un-British Rule in India by Dada Bhai Naoroji, where he also uses a vivid kind of vampiric metaphor of how the economic drain is similar to the blood drain and so on. So that economic undertext of the vampire story kind of moves into South Asia as well. So I would like to know that you have already kind of brought in a lot of rich historical details and details in literary history. And you do mention all these major historical events like the Treaty of Berlin and Austro-Hungarian conflict and so on. So I'm just curious in terms of methodologically, how does this figure like vampire, which in the 19th century is so richly tied to contemporary politics, how does that become a more undead figure, which is kind of literally a body of the past surviving in the present? So there are kind of, in my reading, two temporalities here. One is related to the contemporary, and the other vampire is carrying within it past, quite literally. So is there a tension, and how does that happen?
Yes, I don't think there's really a tension, but I think there is a political bias. What you tend to find is that I write about this less in this book, Dracula in the Eastern Question, and more in this book, which deals with Paul Faval. Paul Faval was a Breton writer who wrote historical vampire stories with real people in, which he writes several, in fact. The first one, serialized in 1856, is La Vampire, all about a vampire originally of Bulgarian background who comes to Paris supposedly to avenge herself on Napoleon Bonaparte just as he's about to be crowned emperor. And in most of these cases, most of these are historical novels. There are real figures. Napoleon actually appears as a character in this text. And what you very quickly find is that a bit like in Le Fanu's Carmel, Faval was a very conservative person. He was a legitimiste, someone who, like Chateaubriand, believed that history had been destroyed by the revolution. And that because with the killing of an anointed king, you lose the sacral element of history. And really what you tend to find, I think, in the work of someone like Le Fanu in Carmela and in the work of Paul Faval as well, is this attempt to really show the resurgence of history going through the ages. The Vampire is less just simply a historical novel and more, through a lot of its names, it's referring to contemporary history in the 1850s. And effectively, you can deduce from that that it's really showing you that because of the original abrogation of royalty with the execution of the king in 1793 and with an upstart becoming emperor, the problems persist. And so you tend to find, I think, that the vampire is used to represent the resurgence of history in a legitimist understanding, an understanding which is very different to, say, the original historical novels of Walter Scott. I would argue in the case of Le Fanu was a lover of Lord Palmerston, who was a pragmatist, who always put Britain's interests first. In the case of Faval, however, he is absolutely a legitimist. He was a very, very conservative Catholic who did not believe that anything good had come from the revolution and that they should have kept the original Bourbon dynasty, and the vampire is a representative of the resurgence. It will just come back again and again. There will be these problems created by that original execution of Louis XVI in 1793 and the end of that reign. That is how I read it. We can see it as a Gothic novel, we can see it as a historical novel, or we can see it as both, an attempt to create an allegory that is conservative and that warns against either the changing of the status quo or too great a liberalism towards one's adversaries, or one that's, in Faval's case, shows the dreadful consequences of what happened as a result of the revolution that cannot be corrected.
Yeah, and since you mentioned the allegorical, I was fascinated to read your discussion of allegory and its reference to Jameson in your book, where you seem to not think of the historical and the allegorical as antithetical at all. Rather, the kind of allegory is.
No.
Yeah. So,
I mean, yeah, I often wonder with Jameson, I mean, that whole theory about third world narratives, I think he means well, but I think in actual fact it's deeply patronizing, isn't it? I mean, the idea that someone writing in Bengal during the Raj is simply writing about themselves in their allegorical and political situation.
Yeah, no.
And vice versa. It doesn't mean to say that a realist writer writing about another part of the world will not actually bring in an allegorical meaning. So I do believe that underneath, inescapably, you can get away from the fairy queen and the kinds of narratives that were written in the Renaissance. You can believe Ian Watt's belief in the rise of realism as a result of the Reformation, and the even look at the idea of the Saint Réal, that Stendhal talks about, that realism replaces idealism progressively in texts. But it doesn't mean to say that allegory ever quite disappears. It will always be there. What I do like is the idea of having an allegorical meaning in a text that you can discern and discover that is actually counter to the surface narration, that the narrator can present things in a way like Laura does in Carmela, which seems naive and simply centered around her own emotional experience, but in actual fact is showing a much, much deeper historical resurgence from the Treaty of Karlovitz up to the Hungarian uprising 150 years later.
Yeah, so now I'd like you to nudge you a little bit towards the medical ideas of the vampire that you have mentioned a little bit, but especially your article on Nicholas Boy and how there is this tension between the medical and the supernatural idea of the vampire.
Yeah, that's a somewhat different thing that I've been doing. I've actually written a series of articles on various tractates that were written in the early 1730s by a whole range of people. And I've written them in collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Damien Shaw. And the first one we wrote was actually on a man who wrote a treatise condemning the supernatural belief in vampirism in 1736. Sorry, it was published in 1737, I think, some years later after the original events of 1732. Boyer was the very first Swede to talk about this. And he was writing at a time when all sorts of people were writing about it, reacting to Fluckinger's original description of what he saw in the Visum et Repertum, which was the seen and revealed, seen and discovered, and which he basically in which he basically condoned the idea, or appeared to condone. He doesn't quite do that. The idea that the bodies were in keeping with what the local peasants of Medvedia had understood as being vampirism, that there was blood in the chest, that the nails and the hair were still vital, etc., and that the bodies had not decomposed from about 14 of the bodies that he looked at. And one of the major issues, there's two major issues. First of all, most of these scientists who were looking at, particularly the ones that are skeptical, were working under the ideas of Hermann Boerhaave, and his Institutes or Institutiones, depending on when you're looking at the English or the Latin original, which was basically a humor-based theory that did believe in animal spirits, but which tried to incorporate Hippocratic understandings of the body having contained and containing parts, and which also gave all sorts of reasons for why it is that something can happen in a body, and pretty much says all sorts of things that, again, could be seen as contradictory. He does, for example, talk about somatic reasons for people believing that they or having an illness, but he also scotches this in other places. He shows that illnesses that are psychological and nervous are often caused by the wrong type of blood getting into the wrong part of the body, and that this can all be cured through horse riding, and that which will distribute the body differently. He talks a lot about fibers and the dispersal of fibers in the body. And what he also talks about how the fever, the burning fever that can kill a person, is often caused by blood getting into the wrong part of the body, too viscous blood, which is caused by too much energy. And that's why so many young people die in this way. And this is a view that Boyer takes when he looks at the results of these bodies. He says that the reason why there's more blood in the wrong place, is probably because you've got to remember that a lot of the people that died were young. They were probably people who'd overexerted themselves. The body had taken up too much blood into the wrong place, and this had caused a breaking of the vessels, and the blood going into different places. And this is one major reason why a lot of these Lutherans, particularly in Sweden, are so skeptical. It's because they're working under Boerhaave's medical theories, and they show that from their point of view that this is something that can be explained in purely medical terms and purely in terms of fever. Another view is that the reason why there was so much blood is because this blood was really ichor, which they understood at the time as being wasted blood that has become watery, and therefore that's why there's so much extravasation, I think is the term, in the bodies. So they gave purely rational understandings. Another thing is the land in Serbia has lots of salt, but they has lots of sand, so salt and alum, and this means that bodies can be preserved for much longer. So they give very, very rational reasons. But there is another reason why they, as Lutherans, cannot accept it. And not all Lutherans were the same. And that is the continuing importance in the belief of the day of resurrection of the body after the apocalypse, etc., when Christ comes back to earth. This was held, thanks to the teaching of Leonhard Hutter, in his compendium of Lutheran thought, published in the late 16th century, as being much more, it was held actually much more literally and as a much more important doctrine than it was even in the Catholic Church at the time. I mean, it still exists in the Catholic Church, but a lot of people sort of found allegorical ways of talking about it. And what this means is that when the body dies, the soul leaves the body, and it can only be reunited with the body when the body has when the day of judgment comes, when the world ends and the bodies and the souls of people are reunited. Okay, this is held very, very seriously by a lot of Lutherans. For this reason, there is often a great dislike of the Paracelsian view of a tripartite body or a tripartite human being, whereby you have a soul, an immortal soul that is immobile and within the body until the body dies, the physical body, and then, if you like, the spirit, which is often made up of animal spirits. If you read Henry Moore, The Immortality of the Soul, he talks about the vehicle of the soul, which can exist outside the body. And that's the reason why we see ghosts. That's the reason why demons happen in what Moore calls the aerial congruity. This is a view that the Lutherans, many of them would not accept, this tripartite division. The fact that, and you find this, that in Latin, there's a distinction between animus, spiritus, and in Greek, pneuma and psyche, and the way in which various theologians, had basically said that this was simply just a mistranslation. There is only a soul and a body. There's no three parts to it. Because otherwise the soul could then suddenly be in another type of body, an aerial body, come back as a ghost, a demon, and excite people and do things. And then what happens when suddenly the day of judgment comes? Where is it? It's not in heaven to reunite with the body. This can't be true. And so that's another reason why Lutherans in particular are very against this idea. But not all are. There were people like Michael Ranft, and Heinrich Zopf, both Lutherans as well, who greatly agreed with this. And because of that, they were much happier to condone a supernatural understanding of the vampire. But that's a slightly different story.
Okay, so does these things anyway map into this? Might be a silly question, but why are all these adversaries of the vampire hunters coming from? They have some kind of a German education and use German phrases a lot. Van Helsing does. He's Dutch, but he uses German phrases. And I'm forgetting the vampire hunter in Nosferatu. But he's also from some I think Swiss university. So is there, I mean, you talked about how it maps into certain ideas among aristocrats in Britain and France, and how it is mapping into the politics in East Europe. But what about the Nordic countries and, more continental, like Germany countries and so on? So is there any reason why you talked about how there are these Lutheran and more kind of skeptical explanations of vampirism who are falling back on medical theories? So is there a connection that can be drawn between these two things?
Well, I think it's more simply to do with the fact that there's various reasons. If we're talking about Berhav, why it is, and if we're talking about the medical practices, at that time, England and Holland were, or had certainly in the 17th century, been the best places to study medicine. That's where you had people like Harvey, whose views on consciousness and the spirit were extremely radical for the time. He believed that blood was itself consciousness. And as John Henry has written in his work, it's truly amazing that he wasn't basically taken up for blasphemy and atheism and annulled. It was just as though this was allowed to continue without the church fathers of the Anglican Church ever getting too worried about it. Looking at Sweden rather than Denmark, Sweden had only become a sort of great place to study medicine. So you had this sudden growth of medical expertise, really from about 1718 onwards, with the end of the Swedish Empire. Swedish Empire, if you look at, say, the University of Lund, these were places that were actually behind the rest of the world. And then there was an explosion of much greater advancement in both chemistry and in medicine at that time. The reason why, I mean, there were, at the time of the original 1732 exposure of what had happened in Kiselova and Medvedia, what you had was a huge debate all across Europe. And in actual fact, you had a lot of debates at that time, and the debates differed very much between Catholic and Protestant. But I don't think that it's necessarily true that Protestants at that time were necessarily more skeptical than Catholics. I think it's just simply that the Lutherans did take the view that the resurrection of the body was still sacrosanct, and were much less likely to be enthused by the Paracelsian idea of a tripartite body. In actual fact, A lot of the views about Paracelsus being a form of Neoplatonism were actually incorrect. That Paracelsus believed that the body was created as a form of creation by God. Each soul was created at the point of birth, rather than being an emanation from a world soul in the Platonian view. And in reality, the division in man was not between three parts: spirit, soul, and body, but actually between four: spirit, soul, body, and the eternal body of Christ, which is reflected in man. So there's a lot of scholarship now which shows that how Paracelsus was seen at the time was not necessarily correct. But generally speaking, I mean, you did get Catholics who were very much against the view of the vampire being real as well, even though what you do have is Catholic rituals in literary texts much later being much more predisposed towards Catholicism. So you were talking about Van Helsing a bit earlier. This is something that Bruce Stewart talks about in one of his articles. Van Helsing, this is where I think you see some of the weirdness of Bram Stoker's understanding of Europe. Van Helsing is Dutch. He's obviously comes from a place which is renowned for good medicine, but he is also almost inexplicably and almost impossibly not a Calvinist, but a Catholic. And that's important for him to understand some of the rituals of using crucifixes and crossing oneself and holy water and other such things. But largely, this is more to do with it being a Gothic novel. The fact that there was a kind of still a prejudice that Catholics tended to be more superstitious. This in the 19th century in Britain, there was a prejudice of Catholics being more superstitious, and so the result of that was that you could combine the Dutch physician, the man of science, with the man who is prone to believing in the immanence of spiritual things and ghosts and other such phenomena.
Great. So that brings me to my last question. If you would like to talk a bit about your recent fictional foray into the vampire.
I've got a copy here. Sorry, I have to just do a plug for your viewers. Hope you don't mind. Yes, that's actually more to do with me working on Bram Stoker. I've been collecting letters as a scholar on Bram Stoker and his correspondence for years now, and I've used some of that in my research. But also I've been hoping at some point to bring out a selected correspondence. But I just a long time ago had an idea about writing a novel, a historical novel, which makes Stoker or gives a different background to how Dracula came into being. I mean, I know how Dracula came into being. I know all about him going to Whitby in 1890 and reading about the Dimitri crashing into the bay, and also the other things that he read about at that time and the interest that he took. Partly, I think that's often not talked about is the importance of Le Fanu's Carmela. He'd actually worked for Le Fanu in a very oblique way in the 1870s in Dublin when he was a critic for the Dublin Evening Mail, when Le Fanu was still a part owner of that newspaper. But he was also, excuse me, he was also very impressed by what he read in the 19th century, this work on Transylvanian superstitions by Emily Gerard. But I decided to get rid of all of that and decide to create an event which spurs the creation of Dracula, as though it was spurred by a whole set of real events. And that was the idea behind the novel that I produced.
Of course, I look forward to reading it. So thank you for that great kind of discussion. Thank you very much.